1 Kings chapter 18, starting with verse 22. He says, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. And so he sets up this challenge. He says, get 2 bulls for us, and let Baal's prophets choose one of them for themselves, let them cut it into pieces, and put it on the wood, but not set it on fire. And he says, I'll prepare the same thing. And then he tells them, you call upon your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, that's the winner. Okay? And all the people said, what you say is good. And so Elijah said to the prophets, choose one of the bulls, prepare it. And so they go through this process. Tells them to call upon the name of their God and not to light the fire. They're going to let their God consume or light the fire for the offering. And so the prophets did that. And it says in verse 26 there, it says, they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Alrighty, 4 or 5 hours. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was what? No response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. And at noon, Elijah had enough. He probably kept his mouth and his tongue quiet here. And so at noon, Elijah begins to taunt them. Hey, shout a little louder. He said, surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. Now, I'm going to bring this up because I had a Hebrew teacher in college teach me this. There also is a point in there that says, well, speak a little louder. He may be in the bathroom, relieving himself. Maybe he's busy. And so they shouted all the louder, verse 28 says, and they slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood actually flowed. And it said midday passed, and they continued their, I like this word, frantic prophesying there until the time for the evening sacrifice. But once again, what? There was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. And then Elijah says to all the people, come here to me. And they came, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. He took 12 stones for the 12 tribes and made them. He says, your name shall be Israel. And with the stones he built that altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench span around it, large enough to hold a lot of seed. And he arranged the wood, he cut the bull into pieces, and he laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water, and I want you to pour it on top of the offering. Pour it on top of the wood. And then he said, do it again. And then he said, do it a 3rd time. And the water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. And so that's what took place. And then look at the prayer. It says, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And then the fire of the Lord fell, and it burned up the sacrifices. It burned up the wood, the stones, and the soil, licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let them get away. And they dealt with them and brought them down, and they slaughtered those false prophets. That's what he did. And all this precedes the prayer that James says is our example with that. And now let's see, though, what's so special then, if you will, about that. Look at verse 41. He says, Elijah then, after all this, he turns to Ahab and he says, go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of heavy rain. Remember, it hadn't rained for how long? 3.5 years. Now he's saying, look, I can hear it. It's coming. So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. Go and look towards the sea, he told his servant. And he went up and looked. There was nothing there, he said. 7 times Elijah said, go back. And the 7th time the servant reported, a cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. And so Elijah said, go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot, go down before the rain stops you. And meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain came up, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way himself to Jezreel. Now that's an interesting miracle in and of itself, but we're not even going to touch that one. Okay, catch that? He outran the chariot. Bionic man here, okay? All righty, $6 million man. Those of you who are old enough, remember that. So this is what we got. You know? So what is it about Elijah's prayer that is such a good example? Well, first of all, he worked at his prayer. Notice how he prays. He prays sitting down with his head between his knees. Now, any of you all do yoga? Okay. Me either, and I don't wish to, because my body does not contort that way. So can you imagine that if you were praying every time you got down on your knees? Of course, if I got down on my knees, getting down isn't always the problem. Getting back up becomes the problem. But he's down on his knees, and his head is literally between his knees. Does not sound like a very comfortable position, does it? It's not a particular posture in prayer, but it was very common for Israel to do that. And I am going to purport this, that he did that, so that position, and there's probably many theological reasons for that, but he chose this extremely uncomfortable way to pray because I believe that Elijah did this to help himself focus on his prayer at hand. He didn't want to be distracted by anything else, and the discomfort kept his mind focused on what he was talking to God about. Now, if you've ever tried to spend extended time in prayer, you probably realize, and maybe you've learned like I have, that when you get to bed and you're laying down and you're going to pray, not always the best method, is it? Okay? It's too easy to what? And, God can understand, but the snoring, I just don't know with that. All righty? And then notice how many times Elijah prays. Not just once, twice, or 3 times. No, he prays 7 times. And he kept at the prayer until he saw an answer. C.H. Spurgeon once said, prayer pulls the rope down below, and the great bell rings above in the ears of God. Some scarcely stir the bell, for they pray so languidly. Others give only an occasional jerk at the rope. But he who communicates with heaven is the man who grasps the rope boldly, and he pulls continuously with all his might. And why should that matter to God? Why should it matter that we work at our prayers? Why should we care that we pull on that bell rope of heaven? Well, because when we work at our prayers, it shows that the answer matters to us. He worked at that. He's persistent with us. And how many have experienced this or seen this? Those of us who have little children, and we go to the store, and we get ready for checkout, or we walk down a certain aisle, and our child says, "Oh, can I have that?" I mean, how many times you looked at somebody else's child in the checkout? Okay? And they're just continuing, "No, Mommy, I need this, I want this," and they keep going, and after, again and again, they ask for it. And you're thinking, what? Just give it to them, you parent. Now, whether you would have done that with your child, that's another story, okay? Okay? And of course, if they're creative, the kids will think of a dozen different ways to remind you that they want that candy or that toy or that object. And why do they do that? Because it's important to them that they get it. And so they work at getting your attention. Likewise, Elijah worked at his prayer. he made it his business to pray. And that morning, when he prayed that evening, that's what he was doing. We need to make it that we go after and we work at our prayers. We need to be intentional. Remember I talked about making a resolution, that being resolute, being intentional. Okay? So I think I might have passed them all out. Some of you will note in your pews, it's a very rudimentary prayer journal. Okay? Go ahead and grab those. Okay? And it is designed for you to be intentional to work at your prayers as we go through this study. Alrighty? That's the point of that we want to work at our prayers, and so we are specific. And we'll talk about why it's important to write down those prayers to be able to use those as we talk about how to pray like a righteous man or woman with that. Elijah worked at his prayers. Okay? Keep that journal handy here. Secondly, Elijah was specific in his prayers. He didn't simply ask God to bless Israel. He was asking for rain. He was asking for a specific answer in response to his prayer. And so when you pray, you need to use prayer requests that can actually be measured, or you can see them fulfilled. Okay? And avoid the generic, bless this person, bless that person. Okay? Be specific. Okay? Because there's no way to determine if God has actually answered you if you're not specific. Okay? I told you last week about my specific little prayer as we came home from Ohio that we needed water at our house. Let's rephrase this. Running water at our house. Because when we left, we had none. And so that was the perfect prayer. And I have a hard time learning this too. Lord, it'd be great if we could have running water so Karen can shower for her surgery and all this sort of thing. And then, even that, as I'm driving home, I thought to myself, well, I'm saying it again and praying, I thought, preferably without leaks. Be specific. God hears you and answer those prayers. To my wife's panic, Sonia heard running water. As I heard it, I'm going, God, I think you're good. Okay? Be specific about that. We have to pray for those. And pray for those things that we desire. With this, I read a story about a guy by the name of Roy Chenoweth, who I actually know, up in Michigan. And he talks about one day he looked at his intern that he had, and he says, he took his intern aside and he says, do you ever intend to be married? The guy says, well, sure, I do. I hope so. And he says, have you ever asked God to help you find that special girl? And yes, his intern said again, have you ever told him what type of girl you wanted? He keeps going on and pushing his intern here. And the intern says, well, I thought that would be kind of presumptuous. And he told Roy this. And he says, no, that's nothing wrong with spelling out what type of girl you want, Roy responded. If you don't